Welcome to M&A Tales, Straw, Sticks, or Bricks. The wolf is ready to find out. This session is presented by Whipfly and Epiphany Law. Let's meet the panel. First, James Rubwright, Vice President and CFO, Tidy Products. Next, Steve Everett, President, Timber Creek. Welcome Rob Macklin, Attorney at Law, Epiphany Law. And your moderator today is Paul O'Neill, Partner at Whipfly. Paul, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate you listening in here. We have a great panel today. We're very excited to have a group of very experienced M&A professionals to discuss M&A issues that they've encountered during their career and talk through some of their stories and hopefully shed some light on some subjects and topics that maybe all of you are wondering a little bit more about. With that, I'd like to start with some brief introductions. Steve Everett, would you mind introducing yourself to the group briefly here and let them know about your background and some of the deals that you've worked on in your career?
Sure. Good afternoon, Steve Everett. I'm currently serving as the president of Timber Creek, which is an FCA packaging brand. My M&A experience dates back over a decade, doing deals with big multinational conglomerate, then later with smaller employee-owned enterprises, and then most recently, we just transacted Timber Creek, which was a family-owned business for more than 30 years, to FCA Packaging out of Illinois, which is actually private equity backed. So a little bit of everything in my background as it relates to M&A.
Wonderful. Thank you, Steve. Jim, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to the group today.
Sure. Great. I'm Jim Rubwright, the CFO for Tidy Products. I've been there for the last little over 6 years now. And over those 6 years, we have done 5 transactions, including a sale right when I started with the company to a private equity firm, a couple of bolt-on acquisitions, and one pretty significant one a couple of years ago. Tidy Products is a manufacturer and seller of medical device components.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jim.
Mm-hmm.
Rob, I'd love to kick it to you. Why don't you introduce yourself to the group?
Thanks very much. Rob Macklin. I'm currently a partner at Epiphany Law in Appleton, Wisconsin. I started my career at Skadden Arps doing big ticket M&A public company work, and then went in-house to a number of different companies where I served as general counsel, and in that capacity did divestitures and acquisitions. So spent a lot of time actually doing the legal work, but also handling the integration. So in my career, I've done everything from minority investments to several $billion-dollar acquisitions, and recently left the world of private equity and went back into private practice.
Glad to have you here. Thank you, Rob. And my name is Paul O'Neill. I am a partner at Whipfly LLP and a managing director in our corporate finance group, Whipfly Corporate Finance. Primarily, I work on sell-side engagements with middle market companies, manufacturing, distribution, business services, and beyond that, do a number of engagements in each year, engaging related to financial advisory and valuation type work. So, really excited about to have this panel here and what everyone's going to be sharing. So I think, Steve, I want to start with you. You noted you've been through many M&A processes in your career. Can you introduce us to the concept of something we're calling inherent risks in a company as it relates to an M&A sale? What are some of those inherent risks that a lot of the people listening today with their own companies are probably facing?
Sure, Paul, be happy to. I think inherent risks to me are those that we know at the outset of a transaction are going to be issues that we need to work through. Inherent risks are risks, however, that are generally dealt with, in my experience, by the ownership of the business and the management team of the business, as opposed to the inherent, which I know we'll get to, where you really need that outside expertise. Example of inherent risks are going to be things like succession planning, things like culture through the process, things like the story crafting as you go into a transaction, things of that nature.
Okay, excellent. Rob, you've had roles, as you noted, in-house counsel, external legal counsel. family-owned companies, PE-owned companies. Can you talk about the concept of, unique company risk or as it relates to the sale of a company?
Sure, absolutely. I think unique risks are going to be what most people think about as a risk to the company. So if you think about a company that's in a particular regulatory space that's unique to them, Jim's company in healthcare, right? There's going to be a significant amount of regulatory risk. You may have a company may have an environmental risk. We acquired Welsh Allen when I was at Hillrom, and they had some property which was located on an old factory that had been there for 120 years, and you have environmental risks that you have to box and take care of. Certainly, ongoing litigation is something that is going to be looked at by an acquirer as a potential risk, as well as that there may be other kind of one-off risks that we'll call unique risks. They may be inherent to a company, but they're going to be odd specifically to that company. Perhaps the company has let's say a company in the web space where they're selling product online. They may have a risk around access and protection of consumer data. Not something you think about necessarily for every company, but it's going to be unique to them. I mean, that said, I think these unique risks are critical. And it's a lot of times people think about when they think about risks. But I would say also those inherent risks to the company that we just talked about are every bit as much deal killers if they're not properly maintained as anything else. And I know when I was on the buy side at a strategic looking at these risks, we evaluated all of them together. But I think the good differentiation here is what can management handle itself versus what is it going to need some outside expertise to help fix.
Yeah, I think Rob makes a good point, and I would point to the sort of unfortunate rash of cyber terrorism as really something that maybe is migrating from unique risk to inherent risk, given its commonplace nature. But I've been through a transaction now where a cyber breach in our history was something that created additional litigation risk, and so that's an interesting topic.
And I think maybe one of the other aspects of both of these risks is going to be the buyer in particular. The cyber breach could be interesting. So if you're looking at a private equity company that is European based, they're going to have a very different sensitivity to things around data privacy than perhaps a U.S. company will. And maybe that's changing, certainly. But certain buyers, certain categories of buyers will evaluate those risks quite differently, whether they're inherent or unique risks.
Steve, I want to start unpacking some of this concept of, inherent risk that companies are facing. And you brought up a couple of real interesting examples. So I want to start with this idea of the story. As a company is contemplating going to sale or is in the sale process, as they're writing the marketing materials, there's this idea of crafting the story of the company. Who are they? What do they do? What's their strategy? How important is that story during call it a sell side process, whether it's a full auction or just a one-on-one? Let's talk a little bit about the importance of that sell side story.
Yeah, I think it's a critical, if not the most critical element, right? It's easy to talk about deals and talk about the numbers, but the reality is the numbers often come later. And, we as human beings are intrigued and brought in, just like any customer would be, by a story, by a value proposition. Mm-hmm. And so the story crafting for the business, the management team and the ownership have to create alignment around what the business is currently, but also what trajectory it's presently on and what is it most likely to become, right? Because as we know, the buyers are buying the future, which is obviously unforeseeable to some degree, but you need to paint the picture and provide a vision that they can wrap their arms around and believe is achievable. I think it's that process early on that's going to engage the most number of buyers, which is frankly going to be to the seller's benefit as the process evolves and you get to those more numbers-based discussions.
Jim, in your experience with deals, and you've been through a number of them, that story crafting, and I know whether you're on the buy side or the sell side, you listening to that story, when does that story crafting begin? How soon? Is this something, all right, I'm going to sell, let's figure the story, we refine the story then, or is this something that's ingrained in the culture? When does that story crafting begin when you're thinking, just in general?
Yeah. If it hasn't started already, it needs to start right now. And I think you hit on it. You have very little time, relatively speaking, in front of a potential buyer to describe the company and to tell the story that Steve described. So ideally, it's ingrained in your culture, and it's not an event for the management team or the leadership team crafting that story. And a transaction brings about a little bit of chaos to an organization because efforts shift and focus shifts to the transaction and the process. And the last thing you want to do is try to figure out that story while you're going through a transaction. So ideally, it's built into the culture from the get-go.
Yep.
And there is that alignment across the leadership team and the management team.
Yeah, I think it's, to Jim's point, he alluded to it. I think it's critical for a seller to understand the volume of deals that a buyer might be looking at any given time, right? I'll analogize it to if you ever gone house hunting and you drive around with a real estate agent over the course of maybe 2 different weekends and you get to your 35th property and they say, oh, didn't you like that one at 2346 Tulip, right? And you're like, I can't even remember that there's a street called Tulip, let alone a house. But the houses that you walk into where there is some unique feature, like it or hate it, you may not remember that it's 2346 Tulip, but you remember that it's got that great stone fireplace, for instance, right? And I think when you have a buyer, whether it's strategic private equity, in my experience, we might have a list of 50 to 60 active targets at any given time. It's in various stages of deals from, hey, they're out there, they're on our radar. We lob in a call once every 6 months to something, far more current. And to the extent that those targets actually have a story that you can remember, when you gather around the table once a month with your corporate development team, you'll remember those companies that have that great stories, that have those great brands, that are tight on their strategy. And that just kind of moves, as a seller, that moves you to the top of the buyer's list, and that creates excitement. And that's, to me, that's critical, because otherwise you may very well get lost in the shuffle, and that could speak to whether you get your deal done or whether you get the deal done at the value you want.
Yeah. The last thing you want a buyer to remember is that company that struggled telling their story. So
yeah,
it's critical to start early and get that ingrained in the leadership team.
Yep. From my perspective, being on running sell-side processes, one of the challenging things is when you have a company that doesn't have that story crafted. And I could ask Steve tell him the story of the companies or his view, and then I ask Jim, and I get 2 different stories, and there's not this cohesive, and that's going to show up all throughout the process. And is there alignment in the management team and in the direction of the company? And what that does is that serves to create uncertainty on the side of the buyer. What is the story? Are they all marching in the same direction to the same beat? And then uncertainty creates, poorer outcomes, whatever they may be, in a number of different ways. No, it's really great.
Paul,
go ahead, Steve.
I think you summarized that greatly, but what I would also make sure our audience understood is that there may be some in this audience that are executives with an owner that is looking to them to help guide them through this process, right? And to assist in that story crafting. And you hit on a key point, and that is that this isn't the story of the owner. This is the story of the business, right? And so having some of those tougher discussions in private, in the closed boardroom meeting, before you're sitting in front of potential buyers, and making sure that everyone understands the message that is going to drive the greatest value and create the fervor and excitement that Rob mentioned. That's where the pre-work, and I love the idea that it's part of the culture, but I don't want to underscore that sometimes you have to have some tough backroom conversations and make sure you've prepared for how you're going to position this.
Yep.
Yeah, it's really important, because I'll piggyback off of that, Steve. One more is, when you're talking about the story of the company, the owner of this company that's selling at some point is going to move on, whether that's 1 day, 1 month, 1 year, whatever it is after the sale. The more that story is the company and not the owner, gives that owner flexibility in moving on, and then it makes a buyer understand that the goodwill of that company is not wrapped up solely in that call it that leader, that owner, that founder, that it's really been incorporated into the company itself. So, and that's what they're acquiring. It's a really, really great point. I think the perfect place to go from here, piggybacking off of this, is I'll call it organizational structure. It impacts the outcome of every transaction, and frankly can be the difference between a deal that gets done or doesn't get done, or even could be an average outcome, poor outcome, versus something that's a really outstanding financial outcome for the sellers, the shareholders. Jim, I'd love you to talk about, within an org structure, what are, either must-haves versus would like to haves in that structure. Not every company is a 20 million EBITDA company that can afford to have a really complex organizational structure, but for the people listening today, what are some of the must-haves versus the really would like to haves, and unpack that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. I think you hit on two of them. One is the ownership and the owner's understanding of what's going to happen. Many times these entrepreneurs hold these companies for a long time, and they're not prepared for that transaction, and they have a hard time seeing themselves not in that seat anymore. So that's one. And the other one you hit on was having a large complex org structure. I would say from an operational perspective, an org structure, whether it be department, org structure, people, products or services, sales channel, the key is keep it simple. The more complex your org structure is, the harder it will be to explain. And back to our earlier point, the harder it will be to be consistent in those management presentations, and the harder for the entire leadership team to be on the same page. With a complex, atypical org structure comes confusion. And that, again, is not something that you want a buyer to remember after that management presentation. So I think it's absolutely critical. Keep it simple, make it easy to explain. Don't try to get fancy. And I think you'll have a better chance of success if everyone on the organization can understand that structure.
Steve, let me ask you that same question from your perspective, some must-haves versus would like to haves, and additionally, when does that structure need to be in place? Does it have to be 5 years before? Could it be 2 years, 1 year, mid? Give us some thoughts on the timing, and then some of the must-haves would like to have from your perspective.
Sure. Well, I would echo Jim's use of the word simplicity, and I do think that's key. As I look at it and try to put myself when I've been on the buy side of transactions, essentially as a buyer, you're looking for who are the individuals that are accountable for the key functions, right? So who's accountable for sales, who's accountable for production or operations, essentially, and who's accountable for finance, right? If we consider those as the three pillars to any business, what I'm looking for as a buyer is who is the individual that I'm being exposed to that clearly has accountability to those tasks. Because essentially, what the sale process is and what due diligence is it's an extended interview process where those individuals are people I'm going to get a chance to make a judgment call on whether I believe they can achieve the story that has been projected, right? Yeah. So as far as timing goes, timing is, I think, different in different situations. And it's terrific if you've got long tenure and demonstrated success. And I think obviously when you've got easy answers like that, it only increases value to some degree. The flip side is if you're looking at long tenured, proven performers in those key accountable roles, if I'm a buyer, I'm also saying, well, how much longer are they going to stay, right? Is this event, this transaction actually going to drive them out? And so what's the succession plan behind that? So the reality is both models can work. A structure put in place 5 months prior to the transaction can be viable if it fits the story and aligns to the work that needs to be done given the individual's competencies, or a long-standing timeline would also work. It's really situational.
If I can just kind of pile on there, I think it's also critical to start with the goal in mind, right? So if I'm in a position where I want to potentially be selling the company, engaging an advisor who can help me value that company and understand where the value drivers are. I mean, perhaps it's, the components are more than the sum of its parts. I've got two different divisions that I want to separate. There may be tax reasons to do that as well. If you have any international component to the organization, there could be issues there. There could be issues internally on tax, or even, if you have in the closely held company instance, having a org structure in place that provides, sort of maximum tax efficiency to the ownership or maximum protection from liability. All of those things can be put in place relatively quickly sometimes, but sometimes you may need several years to season them for purposes of the IRS. So there's definitely a component to understanding where that value is going to be, talking to an advisor 2 years in advance, and then getting your structure in place to be ready to go to market at the right time. Because you may not be able to fix it at the last minute.
Rob, I think that's a great point. And the only thing I would also say is that having been on the leadership teams that have been tasked with preparing a business for sale, the more notice you can give a leadership team to that event, frankly, the more successful they can create, the more successful outcome they can create. So time can certainly be your friend if you know that's where you're headed.
And I think another part of this too, from my perspective, when I talk to a new sell side client or a prospect who's thinking about selling, and you ask them about that organizational structure, and then what are your plans? Well, I'd like to sell and I'd like to retire. Okay, tell me about your organizational structure behind you. Well, I've got someone who kind of runs well, who handles sale. Well, I kind of do that, and then I kind of do that. I kind of do that too. And it's just been natural where you haven't built out to some degree those three pillars you talked about, Steve. What ends up happening is your company still may be very valuable and you still may be able to sell it, but it's going to, in a lot of cases, force that selling owner to stick around perhaps a little longer than maybe they would care to or want to. But in order to extract the value and the equity out, the buyer is going to need them to stick around for that runway of 2-3 years. So to me, that's another key point of, those must-haves. A lot of that is in place too, just to allow a selling owner to be able to, walk away after a shorter period post-close.
Yeah, so true. Rob mentioned, start with the end in mind, right? And so as the seller, you need to know what you want, and then make sure the structure that you have in place and that you're going to be selling will enable that.
Yeah. Steve, go ahead, Jim, please.
Sorry. Yeah. And also, change happens, things happen. You could be in the middle of a transaction and your org chart can change, right? And I think it's key that the leadership team in general is prepared for those types of things. And you may also know that the org chart won't support the organization, future plans, and having that dialogue as a leadership team and having plans in place, knowing what you need to, what adjustments you need to make in the future will be very helpful for a buyer to hear.
Mm-hmm. Steve, having been through some sales with family-owned companies, where let's call it the selling shareholders maybe aren't day-to-day operators, managers, how important is it for that structure, the organizational structure, to be aligned with the selling shareholders' goals? And are there ways to create alignment between the management team and the selling shareholder?
Yeah, well, I would say to start, alignment is going to be critical, right? The most successful outcomes are going to evolve from everyone knowing what the end goal is and working together to achieve it. So there are things, and I think there's two, Paul, things that really need to be done. And one is more of a philosophical, and the other is very tactical. And from the philosophical side, the thing that needs to be done is the owners have to understand that they have to adopt an air of transparency through this process. Their greatest outcome is going to be achieved with them sharing as much information as they possibly can, which oftentimes for entrepreneurs who have controlled their own destiny and driven businesses to great success is something that's difficult for them. But opening up and sharing what's going on, it creates a sense of trust with that executive team that's driving the outcome for them. Mm-hmm. And it is going to drive a much more positive return. The second thing that's really tactical, and I'm sure that Rob and his team have probably put things like this in place. It's where you turn to your legal counsel and say, let's put a couple of agreements together for our employees that actually take the risk out of the equation for the employees, right? Because at the end of the day, as you share this with your leadership team, that initial conversation, a flood of emotions and thoughts goes through your executives' heads. What does this mean for me? What about my kids? How will I do in new ownership? Will they want me to stay on? All of these sort of questions, right? And so as the current owner, to be able to go to that team and say, look, here's what I'm going to do. We're going to create a stay package that incentivizes you to actually achieve the outcome that we've all stated we want. And I'm going to share in the financial reward that I'm going to receive for selling this business. I'm going to share in that with you, right? And the level of that obviously is a personal decision for the owner, but something creates that alignment. And additionally, whether it's a severance opportunity or some sort of protection that, look, this money will enable you to be in a position to take care of yourself and your family in the event that this transaction is good for me and not good for you, right?
Yeah.
So I think if you can take that off the table tactically through the use of an employee agreement, that's going to be a terrific step.
Absolutely.
Okay. Not too dissimilarly, when in a company sale, someone's acquiring one of the most important assets are people, and then by extension that culture. It's really important. You can buy machines, anywhere. It's what puts it all together is the people that actually makes everything come together. How have you seen sale processes affect culture? And are there ways that a business owner, company owner can protect a company's culture during what is a very stressful process as people start to wear multiple hats during a business sale? I'll start with Steve and then Jim. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think as much as you can, you want, yes, a distraction exists when you start a transaction process, especially for your leadership group, right? But as much as possible, the leadership group needs to be focused on maintaining the culture as is, right? You want business operations to continue as is, not only for financial performance results that now potential buyers are going to be evaluating closely, but also for just the sustainability of the organization itself. So if you've been doing luncheons and breaking bread with your employees, then keep doing it. If you've been doing a monthly recognition for employee performance, then keep doing it. And frankly, I would say beyond just that, make sure that you're sharing that with the potential buyers so that they get a sense of who you are as a business and what they are therefore engaging with. Because frankly, their greatest challenge post acquisition is going to be integrating, absorbing that culture in whatever fashion the buyer needs to, whether it be PE or strategic, et cetera. But they're going to want to maintain that. And so to maintain it, they're going to need to understand it.
Yeah, I agree. And the word that comes to mind is be intentional. Be consistent with your culture and be intentional when you're continuing those things that were mentioned. It's important. Again, I agree that a buyer sees that and knows. Yes, it's the people, but the behaviors of those people are really important, which is the culture. So be consistent and be intentional and be as transparent as you can. So there are no surprises, and you kind of lower that fear or that anxiety that happens.
I know when we were on the buy side, I probably, once we got past the initial teaser and sat down with the management team, if you said why did we not pursue a deal, I mean, more than half of the time, if we stopped out of the deal, it was because the culture was bad or the people were bad. I mean, that one reason alone, more than everything else put together, once you get to the point where you're actually talking person to person with the target, is why I think buyers, kill deals. It's just it is the importance of that factor, and it's the intersection with organization and talent succession planning. I don't think it's possible to overstate how important that is. for a seller to have that put together tight.
Yeah, well said, Rob. I want to take a few minutes here and turn to, one of the more obvious risks that a seller potentially is going to face in a deal. These are related to customers and suppliers. This is almost gatekeeping kind of things for a buyer. Let's look at your customer. Tell us about your customer makeup, how many, how big, what industries, what kind of concentration, things like that. And similarly for suppliers. And sometimes they can kill deals. Sometimes they can affect pricing. Sometimes they can be mitigated. Jim, I want to start with you here. In your mind, from a seller's perspective, and I know you've seen it a bunch from the buyer's perspective along the way here. What are you in your mind? What are the biggest risks you're looking for that relate to customers and suppliers when you're contemplating an M&A transaction?
Yeah, I'll start with the opposite of that, and what we're looking for is stability, right?
Yeah.
In addition to the financials, the revenue growth, the earnings growth, cash generation, we're looking for stability and consistency, and that applies to customers. Also, you want a growing and stable and growing customer base. Having agreements in place is again a sign of stability. I think a lot of buyers value that greatly. Not having a high concentration, especially in a particular product line or maybe a keystone product line for your company. We all know there's risks there. If that customer walks away, you could have a problem. So the simple answer is stability, and I think that's what buyers will use to assess risk when it comes to customers.
Jim, can I put you on the spot real quick and ask you how much is too much concentration?
Yeah.
And this is a really subjective answer. Is it 5%? Is it 75%? What are your thoughts on that?
I was thinking about just throwing out a random number and leaving it at that, but I'll try to find the logic behind it.
No, but there's probably a lot of people wondering though, well, how much is too much?
Yeah, I would say in industries that I've been in, low teens is probably getting close to being uncomfortable. I've been in an industry where a customer was over 40% of the sales. That was extremely uncomfortable. I would say general rule, single digits is ideal in terms of percentage of total revenue. Low double digits, fine. You get into the high teens, I would get a little nervous.
Steve, I'd love to hear your thoughts on customer suppliers and maybe even mitigations. What are potential mitigations for some of these customer and supplier risks?
Well, I would echo Jim's thoughts on diversification, certainly. And if I had advice to anybody out there today, it would be diversify on the customer side, which is something you're probably already trying to do. But obviously, the more diverse, the greater stability you can present, and ultimately the greater value I think the business can obtain. In terms of the mitigation, I think this comes down to the agreements that can be in place that Jim mentioned are certainly a great tool, right? That's one literally tangible mitigation strategy. The other thing that I've found in my experience helps mitigate is good anecdotes, right? And this may sound ironic, but you want to remember those instances that you heard your salesman talk about that you can now bring into the discussion. Because while you may not have an agreement with customer X, if you had a great meeting with them 2 years ago when they launched their new line, and you came through for them in a huge way, and they recognized you at the company-wide meeting to say thanks for our supply partner in helping us achieve this goal. That type of example helps personalize the story essentially. So as you're talking to those potential buyers, that's a mitigation strategy that some of us may be able to use.
The good anecdotes, I think, is a great example of the fact at the end of the day that this is still a personal process. I mean, the number of times that I was on the buy side that we would go, yeah, they want 12 times EBITDA. I think they're more like 8 times EBITDA. We could probably stretch to 10. So we flip it an offer at 10. They say thank you, no, and then 6 months later we read a press release that somebody paid 20 times EBITDA for this company, Target. And you're like, what the heck were they looking at when they saw this? At the end of the day, it's still human beings making calls, and so those anecdotal evidences can really benefit someone's comfort level with getting comfortable with amount high teens, customer concentration risk if the anecdotes are good. I think it's a great point.
We talked at the outset this idea of inherent risks business owners are facing. This concept of unique or boxable risk or regular, as you described it. Can you talk about what are some of the strategies out there to eliminate or at least mitigate some of these unique risks, and what are ways to box it? I know there's a lot of different evolving new strategies out there to take care of some of this. What are some things that business owners contemplating the sale should think about?
Yeah, I think it's the commonality here. What we see is between this unique, the inherent risks really is related to the time needed to solve them. In both cases, what we can do is we can have time availability if that allows us to actually fix the problem on a going forward basis. If that's if we have that opportunity. So if we think about those risks and kind of bucketize them, I would say there's probably 2 categories. One is I would put in sort of the reputational category, and one would be pure economic. So a reputational risk could be, a company has a factory in a location around the world that's not well known for, human rights, treatment. Reputational risk could be the target company has a Superfund site. And you may have to find the right buyer that's willing to take that risk on or willing to mitigate it. Those can be difficult because they're going to have an emotional reaction potentially from the buyer. On the other hand, the pure economic risks that you have, those are generally easy to either mitigate or box over time. So if I think about from a buy side perspective, a risk that I can quantify and have certainty on is something that I can actually value and price into the deal. It's the uncertainty around it. So being able to box those risks is quite critical. Perfect example would be litigation, right? If you have outstanding litigation, I can put a settlement offer out there. We can put it under the federal's procedure, and perhaps we know that there's going to be a cap on the amount available. That's quite simple, and a buyer can handle that. It's going to be a little bit harder, and time. You're going to have to spend some time thinking about a risk where there isn't perhaps a neat little nifty box to put around it. And that's where kind of getting to your advisors early and saying, okay, I want to sell this company in 3 years. What can we start doing with this compliance risk? Well, we need to put a compliance program in place, and that's going to get a buyer comfortable 3 years from now. Putting it in 6 months before you sell may not work. And so really it's at the end of the day, it's all about time, understanding where they are, and really, kind of not putting your head into the sand and just trying to solve them.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think if you come to the conclusion COVID hits and I'm done with this and I just want to sell, that can work, and you can still have a successful outcome. What I will say is someone who advises on the sell side, Rob is someone who advises on the sell side, and actually we're both on the buy side as well. And Jim and Steve, who've been involved in transactions, what I will say, and I'm going to leave, I think, everyone with this, is the more time that you can be thoughtful to put strategies in place, to craft that story, to think about your organizational structure, some of those other inherent risks, customers, suppliers, unique risks that how do we box, how do we mitigate? Time is your friend, and the more time and the more thought you invest with your management team and your trusted advisors, it may cost you some dollars on the front end, but what it's going to do is it's going to make a smoother, more certain outcome on the back end when you actually do go to sell, and you will maximize your dollars in the sale of your company. So take the time, consult with your advisors, and time is your friend when you're getting ready to sell. So don't wait to the last minute. Steve, Jim, Rob, really appreciate your time here with us today, sharing your expertise. And I think probably our folks know you can find us, have our contact info, so don't hesitate to reach out to any of us with questions.
Thanks very much.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.